Growing up with a sleepwalker in the family gets old pretty fast. At first, everyone is a bit concerned that they'll hurt themselves or wander out of the house. These fears aren't unwarranted. The sleepwalker isn't aware of their actions, and everyone else is usually, well, asleep. We only discovered my little brother was an apparent sleepwalker when we kept waking up to all of the doors and windows open in the morning. Since we live in a rural area, this wasn't too much of a danger beyond potential wild animals roaming in. Still, as the older sibling, my parents designated me as the official keeper of my brother's actions. We shared a room, you see, and they wanted to use that to my advantage when it came to retrieving and sending my brother back to bed. The common saying of "don't wake a sleepwalker" isn't as big a deal as you think. As long as you wake them gently and they're aware of their condition, they're not going to hurt themselves or be startled. Why would they be? They've just woken up after all. First, we tried bells on the door. When that failed to wake me up, my parents tried leaving plastic sheets on the floor. We tried just about everything you could possibly think of to try and alert me when he got up, and that was when my father came up with the idea of a string. Every night, my brother and I would tie a long string to our wrists and go to sleep like that. If he got up at any point, the tugging of him exiting the room woke me up pretty quickly. It was a harmless, noiseless, flawless plan that had me bringing my brother to bed long before he opened our home to the elements and animals outside. You get used to it. The string, the tugging, retrieving the sleepwalker, and putting them back to bed. Some nights he would get up more than once, and others he wouldn't sleepwalk at all. Either way, that was the only variance in an otherwise rigid routine we had. There was no spooky words out of his mouth during his sleep, no strange place he kept going back to, and no motive behind opening the doors and windows. When asked, my brother simply stated that his dream was unrelated and he didn't know why he would open the home. This went on for the better part of a year before finally dying down. We gradually stopped tying the strings to our arms before sleep because my brother stopped getting up. One night in late July, I remembered going to bed a bit earlier than usual after we took a trip down to the river for the day. Naturally, I was exhausted from an afternoon of paddling against the current and running around the nearby park with other kids my age. At some point during the night, I woke up, having become a very light sleeper thanks to my duty as watchful eye over my brother in the last year. I remembered feeling hot and sticky thanks to the humid weather, getting up and opening the window, flipping the fan on, and hoping that some air circulation might help. But when I turned to go back to bed, I saw my door was cracked open about 2 inches wide. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized there was something else as well, a face. Just beyond the threshold of the door, a small, pale face was pressed up to the crack, one big brown eye staring in at me lazily. My fear turned to frustration in an instant when I realized I was looking at my brother, who was standing completely still outside the door and more than likely sleepwalking again. With a deep breath, I gathered myself and grabbed the door handle. Go back to bed, Jesus Christ. Can't you just be normal for one night? And then I slammed the door shut and returned to bed. It was mean, but I was getting tired of it, you know? After a long day, I just wanted to sleep, and if he was just going to stand out there all night, then it wasn't my problem. The next morning was nothing special. Mom made breakfast, and as we sat down at the table, I noticed my brother wasn't up yet. That was weird. He was always an early riser and eager to greet the day. I'm guessing Joe is sleeping in today? I asked, idly picking and stabbing at my waffles. My dad set down his coffee and looked up from his paper, his brow crinkled in confusion. Joe went to stay at Andy's house last night, he said. Then slowly his face softened and he chuckled. You went to bed early, so you couldn't know. Suddenly, I wasn't very hungry. My stomach flipped and my throat felt tight. When did he go? Shortly after you went to bed, when we got back. I didn't tell my parents what I saw, worried that maybe something was now wrong with me. Instead, when my little brother came home later that day, I elected to reinstate the string system just as a precaution. Joe seemed confused but was compliant, joking about how we're tied together forever. It was a strange comfort in a way. The string was reliable, predictable. And that was it. For the next few months, Joe and I both slept soundly with few sleepwalking incidents. I was thinking about dismissing the string again, but decided that just one more night wouldn't hurt either of us, just to make sure he wasn't getting up and wandering off. And it had become a source of a handful of inside jokes for us, sibling bonding time, that kind of stuff. I think we both almost slept better when it was on as well. I woke up to a harsh tug on my arm quite suddenly. It was pitch black besides my alarm clock nearby, which read the time at 2:25 a.m. That wasn't the usual time Joe got up if he did sleepwalk, but variations could happen, and with a sigh, I began to throw my covers off and slide out of the bed. That was when the second hard yank on the string nearly sent me tumbling to the floor, and I found my anger welling up pretty quickly. I thought he must have gotten the stupid string caught on something and was trying to pry himself loose, so I collected myself and hurried towards the door that was already open. That was when I noticed something was wrong. The string was only long enough to keep us maybe 5 feet apart at the most, but this string was longer and pulled taut down the hallway and around the corner. "Joe?" I called quietly. This didn't feel right at all, but I made my way down the hall and turned the corner just in time for a third tug on the string. It was leading into the kitchen, which featured a door to the basement that was now wide open as well. The string was descending into it and the tugging beyond it was growing more intense. Impatient. This wasn't like Joe at all. He'd never gone in the basement before, let alone manually pull on the string. "Joe, are you awake? This isn't funny." I was louder this time, inching towards the open door as the string began to frantically vibrate and yank, and as if it was urging me further. The closer I got, the more excited it grew, and when I reached the doorway, the next tug was so harsh that I almost lost my balance again. Then there was a lull in the tugging when I heard a door opening behind me, the bathroom across the hall from my room. A bleary-eyed Joe stepped out and blinked, one hand rubbing his eye as he yawned. There was no string on his wrist. Suddenly, the string began to pull with a force stronger than before, making me stagger out onto the first step leading into the basement with a yell. Joe seemed to realize that I had the string on my wrist, and he didn't, and that whomever or whatever was in the basement was not him. There was a roar of noise, a low moaning from the darkness of the basement, and my little brother's frantic footfalls behind me as he ran his way over and grabbed my free arm to hold me while he scrambled for something to cut the string. I heard the kitchen drawers crashing open as he searched, and then he produced a knife, one shaky hand sawing at the string as the noise in the basement became so loud it seemed to reverberate through our bones. And then the tugging stopped. The string snapped away, and both Joe and I fell backwards onto our asses, sprawling over the kitchen floor. The noise ceased when the string was cut, and the basement door wobbled violently before slamming shut in our faces. Going to sleep after that was impossible, so Joe and I huddled up on my bed and sat with every possible light on in our room until the sun rose and our parents got up. Naturally, they didn't believe us, saying they hadn't heard a thing and slept soundly. They said that we must have hallucinated together or been sleepwalking even. Either way, I know that whatever was in the basement was not my brother, and I've refused to tie the string to my wrist ever again. I lived in a relatively small town in Texas, in a small house with my mom. My mom has always had a very caring heart for those in need, so when my uncle called her one night and told her he ran into a homeless girl at the local park, my mom offered to help her out for a day or so just to get back on her feet, that sort of thing. When the girl arrived at my house, she said her name was Laura. Laura told us she was 16 at the time. She seemed like a shy girl. When my mom asked what she was doing out on the streets, Laura told us she had been kicked out of her home by her mom because her mom had accused her of sleeping with her boyfriend. Laura told us that allegation wasn't true. She told us her mother's boyfriend was the one who came onto her. My mom gave Laura a place to sleep in the guest bedroom that night. The next day, after breakfast, Laura asked to use my mom's house phone to call her mom to see if she could get some of her things from her mom's house. Laura's mom never answered the phone, and we felt bad for her. As a 10-year-old girl, I couldn't imagine what she must have been going through. Later that day, I remember watching TV in the living room and minding my own business, but I could feel someone staring at me, so I turned my head where I felt the gaze. Laura was sending me a glare so cold that if looks could kill, I would have dropped dead. I was confused and a little startled. I turned my head away from her quickly and went back to watching TV, but I could still feel Laura's cold gaze. I couldn't understand what I had done to her to cause her to look at me with such hate. The next day, it happened once more. I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I could feel someone looking at me. I turned my head to the side and saw Laura's head peering around the corner at me. Her eyes were dark and laced with hatred. It frightened me, and so I felt confused as to why she was looking at me like this. I didn't want to cause any trouble, so I didn't bring up Laura's death glares to my mother at all. Later that night, my uncle had joined us for dinner. He had stopped by to see how everything was with Laura and if we had any luck finding her a place to live with one of her family members. After dinner, I was washing my plate in the sink when I heard a loud growling sound come from the dining room. I turned my head to see Laura shaking and growling like some sort of wild animal. My mom and uncle looked disturbed and worried. Laura threw herself onto the floor and began thrashing around and screaming as if she were possessed. I was absolutely terrified. It was a scary thing to witness. I grew up very religious. My mom and uncle began praying out loud for Laura while I ran to my room and closed the door. This went on for 2 hours, but it felt like an eternity of horror. I could hear Laura screaming like a mad woman and growling like some sort of deranged beast. I don't think any of us knew exactly what was going on. After my mom and uncle had prayed for Laura for what felt like forever, Laura told us she was free from an evil demon that had taken over her. None of us were sure what had caused her behavior. None of us were sure what had happened. I peeked my head out of my room to see Laura smiling happily while she curled up on the couch with a blanket. Her eyes opened and she shot a cold glare at me. I quickly closed my bedroom door in fear. I placed a chair in front of my bedroom door and went to sleep. I woke up the next morning by my mom waking me up. She told me that she was taking me out to eat at my favorite restaurant. When I asked her if Laura was going, she gave me a serious expression and spoke. "Your uncle is going to take Laura back to her mom's house. He slept on the couch last night after what happened. He and I were talking when the two of you had gone to sleep, and we pieced together that Laura made the entire performance up last night. She said she is not stable, and we think she is dangerous." As I heard my mother say those words, relief washed over me. I got dressed and went to the car to go to the restaurant with my mom. When we got into the car, we saw Laura and my uncle getting into his truck with her. Laura looked angry. Her expression was of a child's when you don't give them what they want. She got into my uncle's car and they drove away. I'm 22 now, and I have never forgotten about this horrific incident that happened in my life years ago. After that day, I never saw Laura or heard anything else about her ever again.
I'm never online shopping again. I messed up. I messed up so bad. I don't know if I'm in danger or going to jail or what. I don't know how I'm going to live with myself. This all started in the break room Wednesday. As I shoved my leftover Chinese into the microwave, Brian leaned back in his chair, inviting Dave to come over Saturday to light up the pit for his birthday. "A small gathering," he said. "I never get invited to those things. Never. I told myself it's because I'm in lower management, but I know the truth. I'm awkward around people. I try too hard." "Man, I used to do a mean smoked chicken back in the day," I interrupted. I'd never smoked a chicken in my life, but I felt confident no one would be asking me to. "Have a great party, Brian." I don't know why I butted in. I guess I was just tired of being ignored. As I reached for the door, fried rice steaming, Brian invited me to the party. I stopped, hand just short of the knob. Sure, I'd misheard. I know it's dorky to admit, but I had to shove my grin down a couple notches to avoid looking like Patrick Bateman as I turned back around and accepted. I still remember what I told him. "Aw man, I'm great at gifts. I'll see you there." In truth, I'm awful at gifts. I'd been sitting on my sunken couch looking around online for ideas for nearly an hour with no luck. Finally, I settled on a gag gift, something that could be regifted amongst the cool guys in the office occasion after occasion. I wasted another 15 minutes fantasizing about the guys passing the gift around and talking about how I started it all. How witty and funny I was. I could be an office legend. I know it's crude, but Brian had said it would be a small gathering. I figured a few guys from the office and maybe an old friend or two. I decided to take inspiration from my college days and scour the internet for a sex doll. I sucked my breath as I scrolled through the outrageous prices. Just as I was about to give up and go with an old-fashioned blow-up doll, I found a listing from Bad Dolls For You, and she was perfect. The doll's name was listed as Alice. The brief description under the picture proclaimed a taste of Wonderland. I couldn't help but chuckle. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and just over $100 with overnight shipping included, the fleeting thought occurred to me that at that price point she might be used. But honestly, did it matter? No one was going to be partaking in any activities with her. At least, I hope not. She was to be the white elephant gift passed among the guys. She was the legacy I'd leave behind as I moved my way up management. She was how the guys would know deep down I was one of them, and they could invite me to bar crawls and parties. She would deliver me from this god-awful loneliness. God, I was so stupid. Without any more hesitation or reading, I pressed buy now. I was giddy. She was perfect. I laid in bed that night fantasizing about the shock on Brian's face as he opened the gift. The guys would howl with laughter. They'd slap me on the back, give me some high fives. It was going to be great. The following morning, I woke up with an extra pep in my step. I hummed while I ran the steamer over my collared shirt and gave myself a foamy grin in the mirror as I brushed my teeth. As I strolled to the kitchen and grabbed my cup of joe, there was a swift knock at the door. It couldn't be. Not this early. And yet when I opened my apartment door, there stood a large box. I was elated. I dragged the box in quickly and slammed the door shut. In my excitement, I ripped the box open like a wild animal. I tore the packaging sheet off the top and paused. She was beautiful, sure, but she wasn't exactly as the ad had shown. Her blonde hair was a bit matted, like a childhood doll forgotten in the bottom of a toy box. One eye was a clear crystal blue and the other an odd yellow. Her freshly oiled bondage leather attire shone in the light. Maybe she wasn't perfect, but she'd do. With only 10 minutes before I needed to leave for work, I roughly brushed through her hair. She wouldn't win any awards, but she was smoother than before. Glancing back at the destroyed box, I realized I wasn't sure where to put her. My first thought was to just leave her out, but what if there was a maintenance emergency? I didn't want the office to think I was weird. I bit my lip and settled for the closet. I shoved her in quickly and went out the door. Work dragged on. Everything seemed so trivial knowing the work I had cut out for me at home. I had decided to pull Alice's hair into pigtails to further smooth her hair and give her another once over to make sure I hadn't missed anything else in my morning fumble with her. The guilt of cutting out 15 minutes early from work didn't haunt me like it generally would. I swung my apartment door open and bellowed, "Honey, I'm home." My chuckle was cut short as I entered my bedroom and found Alice lying on top of the comforter on my bed. I froze. Someone had been in my apartment, and they had moved her. I slowly approached the bed, looking Alice over. She certainly looked the same, but nonetheless, I decided to call the office to see if maintenance had been through. According to the impatient woman who answered, no one had entered my apartment. An eerie feeling swept over me, but I figured in my excitement this morning I'd opened the closet door, but for some reason laid Alice on my bed. I was excited and I must have been in a rush. I'm forgetful sometimes. Regardless, my enthusiasm had withered. I pulled and smoothed Alice's hair into pigtails before placing her into the closet and firmly shutting the door. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense that I'd been careless this morning. I'd spent a good chunk of the night lost in thought about my perfect surprise. I'd just hit the hay a little earlier tonight. I'd power through tomorrow, and the following day was the party. After a quick TV dinner, I slid into bed. The thought of Alice laying there staring up at the ceiling returned. I rolled over a few times, but eventually sleep came. I jerked awake suddenly to the terrible certainty that someone was staring at me. I was cemented on my back with my eyes fluttering quickly at the ceiling. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out something hovering a few inches from my face. I stifled a scream as I slowly turned my head towards the figure in the dark. Alice was bent down on all fours with her mouth stretched open far too wide for what she was intended for. Something in my brain, something primal that had helped my ancestors survive in the forest with carnivorous beasts, told me with great certainty that if I hadn't awakened when I had, she'd have eaten me. Her mouth would have continued to pop and stretch like a snake, and she'd have swallowed me whole. I shoved her hard and leapt onto my feet on the other side of the bed. Terror gripped me as I scrambled to escape my bedroom. I threw my gaze back into my room, expecting Alice to be yanking at the knob from the other side with her jaw jiggling unhinged at her chest. But nothing moved through the crack in the door. I flipped the light from the other side of the doorway and waited. I held my breath, but I couldn't hear anything over the roaring of my blood pressure in my ears. Slowly, I cracked the door completely open. I climbed back onto the bed and leaned over to see Alice sprawled out on the floor. Her head was turned sideways at an angle that begged a broken neck. Her yellow eyes stared dreamily under my bed. She looked different, paler, almost gray. Her youthful cheeks were now sunken. She looked long since dead. "Hey!" I yelled. I didn't expect her to answer, but there was a flood of relief when she didn't flinch. She won't move as long as I'm watching her. I didn't know where the thought had come from, but I knew it to be true. I reluctantly turned to boot up my laptop. I realized far too late that I should have read the rest of the ad. Something was very, very wrong with this doll. Alice was marked as out of stock, but the ad was still there to read. "A taste of Wonderland, the perfect doll for your enemy. Let her ravishingly good looks lull them into a false sense of security before the sweet Alice transforms into a cutthroat queen of hearts. Off with their heads. Just 3 days until your sweet, sweet revenge. Alice will eliminate her owner on the 3rd day, so please make sure she has been gifted to a new owner before that time. We advise leaving no return address. This isn't a gift you want returned to you. Happy haunting." My stomach felt full of ice. I was going to die. This goddamn doll was going to kill me. I threw my laptop against the wall and sobbed. I went to the garage, grabbed some leftover cheap rope from my room and 2 old bike locks and went to work tying Alice up. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I couldn't risk her moving around anymore. I'd die of a heart attack before she ever had a chance to kill me. Although at the moment, this might not be the worst way to go. "Off with their heads," flashed through my mind. Sleep didn't find me again that night, but in the early hours of the morning, I had made a decision. I didn't want to die. I would go to work, keep up appearances, and on Saturday, I would give Brian the doll. At work that morning, I was utterly distracted. Alice was bound on my couch, but the thought of not being able to see her worried me. At noon, I shut my office door. I jumped when my coworkers knocked and nearly vomited when the phone rang. At some point, I'd have to go home. At some point, I'd have to wrap Alice up, stick a shiny bow on her, and give her to Brian. At some point, I'd be a murderer. Despite my want to get everything over with, I found myself the last to leave the office. I stopped quickly at the store for wrapping paper. I meant to go straight home after and deal with Alice, but I stopped at the bar for a few drinks first. Lightly stumbling, I entered my home. As I flicked on the light, my heart shot out of rhythm. I slammed my fist against my chest twice before the cramp in my chest subsided. Alice wasn't how I'd left her. She stood in the center of the living room with her head tilted back, one hand raised in a fist, holding a butcher knife ready to thrust towards the ceiling like a victor's battle sword. She looked more rotted corpse than beauty. I'd had enough of this doll. I pried the butcher knife from her gnarled hand and laid her down on the floor. I had no thoughts as I wrapped her. When I was done, she resembled a dead body wrapped in a tacky wrapping paper instead of a sheet. I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't risk her unwrapping herself. I took Alice with me and propped her against the garage wall as I reclined the passenger seat all the way and shoved her inside. I had no idea what I'd tell law enforcement if I was pulled over, but I couldn't risk not keeping an eye on her. Just after 11:45, I cut my headlights as I pulled in front of Brian's house. I nearly left. I started to cry again. I'd even switched the car back into drive with my foot pushed heavily on the brake, but the wrapping paper finally rustled. Exhausted and bordering on a psychotic break, I shoved the shifter back into park and got out of the car. Carefully, quietly, I took Alice to the door. I rang the doorbell 4 times fast and ran to my car. My tires squealed as I tore away from the house with just enough time to see Alice fall through the opening door. I didn't go to Brian's party. I couldn't. Guilt feasted on me through the weekend. I barely ate, barely slept. When I did, Alice was there, butcher knife in hand, rotted flesh flapping from her jawline as she screamed in a dying animatronic voice, "Off with their heads!" Today is Monday. I'm sitting at my desk. We've been open for just over an hour. Brian hasn't showed up or called in. Just before I posted this, I went back and checked Bad Dolls for You's ad. I wanted to reread it to make sure I didn't miss anything. The ad has been updated. One left in stock. Order now. I'm probably breaking the law by writing this down. Of course, a priest is not allowed to tell anything that was said in confession, but I think this man is an exception. I need to tell someone. Anyone. I was a priest for quite a few years now, and I'd gotten used to the job. So when a man came into the church and went straight for the confession booth, I wasn't surprised at all. He didn't introduce himself, but that was not unusual either. Some people preferred total anonymity when they confessed their sins. I didn't get to see him properly. He wore a gray sweater and its hood was pulled deep into his face, obscuring all his features. Still, I didn't think too much about it. Just joined him in the booth like I was supposed to and greeted him with the same words I had spoken countless times already. He stayed silent at first. I gave him a bit of time because I thought he just didn't know how to begin. But after several minutes, I asked him what he wanted to confess. A few more seconds passed and then he spoke. He told me he had gone into the woods, and he said that in a tone as if I should have known that already. That was all. He did not elaborate any further, as if that would already count as a sin. I thought him to be a hunter then, asking for forgiveness for the lives of the animals he had killed. Maybe it had been his first hunt and the weight of the innocent lives was heavy upon him. I asked him to continue. He told me about a small clearing where the grass is greener than in the rest of the forest, and about the small cabin that stood on said clearing. Then he fell silent again. I asked why he considered this a sin. That made him laugh for a second, and the sound made my skin crawl. It was an ugly, manic laugh. He didn't explain his reasoning, just stood up and left. I was taken aback by all this. Sure, but I just assumed that it had been some weird joke. Either way, I was certain I'd never see the strange man again. I was wrong, of course. He came to the church the next day and walked straight to the confession booth once again, expecting me to follow him. Of course I did. That was my job, and also I hoped he would clear a few things up. I had thought a lot about his earlier confession. He only said he barely slept lately. I answered that I, too, struggle with insomnia, and asked once again why he considered this a sin. He laughed again. I wanted to tear my skin off. There was another person who visited the church frequently, outside of the services on Sunday. A young woman who always sat in one of the front rows and silently prayed for a while. We talked a bit sometimes, and she was very polite. I liked her. When she came by the next time, she told me how she felt watched in her own home, and she didn't feel safe there anymore. She prayed for that terrible feeling to go away, and I took the time to pray for her safety. The strange man came by every single day, and he always spoke 1 or 2 sentences at most. None of them were a sin. After just 3 days, he started repeating himself, talking about the woods and about his insomnia again. Always the same things, like a broken record. Even the wording was the same. The first change came the day after my conversation with the young woman, as he stayed silent at first. I asked him if he knew her, just because I had a bad feeling about him. He laughed. I bit down on my lip until I bled. He didn't say a word that day. The man was bad news and I knew it. His visits were going on for over a week at this point, and I had yet to see his face. He always wore that hood and he went straight to the booth each time. Sometimes I only saw him in the corner of my eye. There was no pattern in his arrival. I tried coming in sooner or later, but it made no difference. He came by a few minutes after I got there. He seemed to know when he had to arrive to meet me. After his strange reaction to my question, I was even more worried about the young woman. Knowing that a freak like him was out there made my insomnia even worse. I lay awake in my bed thinking about her. When I couldn't take it any longer, I drove over to her house because I felt like the least I could do was bless her apartment. I hoped it would make her feel better. She was reluctant to let me in at first. The poor thing, completely paranoid about something she didn't even know if it was real. She had never seen someone, she had told me earlier, but there had been the most intense feeling of being watched. I explained my intentions, and then she finally stepped aside and let me into the flat. She appreciated what I was going to do, she told me. She would indeed feel safer if someone blessed the house. Then at least she could be sure God watched over her. I intended to begin where the feeling was worst, her bedroom. It had a single window that faced towards the backyard. As I stood alone in that room and looked outside, I saw him standing there. He faced me, though his face was hidden under the hood of his gray sweater, and he stood perfectly still. We stayed like that for several seconds. He began to laugh. The window was closed, but the sound was so loud as if he stood right beside me. I scratched my skin violently. The young woman burst into the room and yelled at me to leave. I tried to ask her if she knew the man, but she didn't let me speak a single word, just screamed at me that I should get out of her flat and never come back again. She cried and basically shoved me outside. I told her to call the police. She almost slammed the door into my face. She did call the police. They apparently found the suspect and questioned him, but he seemed perfectly sane and not at all likely to stalk someone, and they dropped the case again. There was no evidence after all. The man came to church as always, but after the police had gotten involved, the monotony of his confessions was changed. I remember his words clearly. "Don't try to lock me away, Father," he hissed, and his voice was cold and cruel and oh so angry. "I've been locked away for far too long." The young woman didn't come to church anymore. The monotonous confessions of the man continued every single day like a clockwork. The woods and his insomnia always told with the same words. I tried to catch him a few times to exit the booth at the same time as him, just to see his face at least. He was always gone by the time I exited. After just a few days, I decided to visit the clearing the man always mentioned. The grass was indeed greener around the small cabin, and as I walked up to the building, I had the most intense feeling of déjà vu. The stench of decay hung in the air. I was just about to touch the doorknob as intense vertigo hit me. I must have blacked out at this point, because the next thing I knew, I was sitting in the confession booth with the strange man on the other side. He asked me when I had last slept. I had no answer, and he laughed, and I dragged my fingernails across my face until I bled. The insomnia took its toll. I blacked out for short periods of time. A day later, I found myself kneeling in front of the altar, the gilded chalice with red wine in my hands, and couldn't remember how I got there. But I remembered that I had intended to pray for the young woman, and I did just that. Then rose the chalice to my lips and drank. The wine tasted off. I was hyper aware of the metallic taste that must have belonged to the chalice and wondered if it was growing rust. My prayers had no use, though. I heard from another church member that the young woman had gone missing. I knew that she was dead, and I knew where she was buried, but I had not a single piece of evidence, and I didn't want to raise suspicion about myself, so I never called the police. God would judge the strange man, I told myself. He could not escape his punishment. The day after I heard about the woman's disappearance, the strange man was already waiting in the booth for me when I arrived. There was no visible clue that he was in there, but I was sure about it. And although I could have just turned around and went back home, what I probably should have done, I resigned to my fate and entered the booth. He spoke without hesitation this time, and these words are burnt into my mind by now. "Do you want to confess your sins, Father?" he asked, and he sounded smug and somehow satisfied. I stayed silent, not knowing what he expected me to say. I wasn't aware of any sins I had committed lately, none that would interest him at least. Instead, I wanted to ask him why our roles were suddenly subverted, but he started to laugh and I tried to claw my face off again. A few days later, I met another woman at church. I had seen her at almost every service. We had never talked before, but she always smiled politely. She stayed behind after the latest service and asked if I was alright. Apparently, she was worried because of the deep, bloody scratches on my face, but I couldn't tell her the truth, so I said nothing at all. She was really nice. Said I didn't have to tell her, but that she was always there to talk if I wanted to. I have yet to accept the offer. The situation with the strange man didn't change. He was waiting for me every day when I entered the church, and each time he asked the same question. "Do you want to confess your sins, Father?" I never answered. He always laughed and I scratched my face open until one of us got tired of it and left. It's been like that for 6 weeks now. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't remember the last time I slept. The strange man's laughter echoes through my head at any given moment. My skin is a torn mess to the point where I have trouble to get the blood out of my clothes. One of my favorite sweaters is ruined already. I know I should just not walk into the confession booth. I should stop talking to him, but I can't. I tried and I always end up in that booth, tearing my skin open while he laughed. Maybe I should just confess my sins. If I only knew what he wants to hear. I will stop writing here. Maybe someone can tell me how to get rid of him. Until then, I have more important matters to take care of. The next service is soon, and we're all out of wine. I need to go get some more.